Well, hello and welcome to Quasi Experiments. Well, in our last lesson, we looked at different kind of locations for research. We talked about laboratory experiments, highly controlled environments. We talked about field studies, which take place in more natural environments. We also talked about doing research online. However, there's another type of experiment that we need to look at. They're called quasi experiments. Quasi or quasi, you choose, is means, I think it's Latin for almost. So these kinds of experiments are almost experiments, and there are two types. We've got natural experiments, and we've got what are known as different studies. Okay, so here's an example for natural experiment, and I'm going to let you read it. Okay, if you need to pause there for a moment, that's not a problem. But the upshot of the research was that perhaps the theory was that women who were pregnant when their husbands were killed went on to have babies who developed schizophrenia. So ask yourself, okay, in this study, what was condition A, what was condition B, and what was the independent variable? And the big question is, how did the psychologists manipulate the independent variable? And of course, they couldn't manipulate that. We can think about why that would be the case. It just happened by itself. Psychologists are not allowed to shoot people to see who has an effect on their wives. It's an ethical issue, and we'll be talking a lot more about ethical issues in the next few lessons. So in the natural experiment, instead of manipulating a variable, the researcher makes use of the naturally occurring variables. So it's not a true experiment, because it's only a true experiment if the scientist is actually manipulating the IV. So that's why they're called quasi experiments, because they're almost experiments. There is a difference between two conditions, but it's not quite an experiment because the psychologist hasn't manipulated the independent variable. Yeah, so it looks like a real experiment, but it's not quite. Okay. So we've got this other study now. Lots of studies about, does watching violence on TV, does it affect children? And as it says here, it would be impossible to sit children in a lab for years watching violent programs to study the long-term effects. Again, ask yourself why. So therefore, what psychologists had to do is that they had to compare children who watch a lot of TV to those who watch very, very little. I'll just get my head out of the way. Or they studied communities before and after television. And why is that an actual experiment? So here we have the reasons why we use natural experiments, and as you'll see, a lot of it could be to do with ethical issues. There are some situations that psychologists aren't allowed to create in order to compare different groups of people. Again, if you need to pause that, make some notes on that, that's fine. So again, so this example of abusive marriages on women's stress levels, again, as we can clearly see, we wouldn't be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to create a situation like that. But if those situations exist, we might be able to get hold of other women who are seeking a divorce because of abuse, and then see what kind of effect that has had on their stress level. So there we have the first type of natural experiment, or quasi experiment, and that's known as a natural experiment. The second type that we need to understand is this idea of a difference study. And again, so this is something that's natural, but it's not something that's been manipulated at all. It's just a difference between people. So Sheridan and King, for example, investigated gender differences in obedience. Gender was the IV, but obviously they didn't have to do any manipulation. That's a very interesting experiment. They found that that women were much more likely to give electric shocks to puppies, even when they could see the effect of the shocks on the puppies in front of them, than men. Rosenbluth again looked at differences in smelling abilities between sighted versus non-sighted children. There was no manipulation involved there at all. They just looked at a difference that already existed. Okay, so in terms of the exam, you need to be able to explain the difference or the advantages and disadvantages of natural experiments. So we've got those ideas there. We can do research with groups of people that it would be unethical to, or for situations that it would be unethical for us to create. And of course, because it's taking place in a natural environment and the experimenter isn't actually doing anything, then there's a high level of ecological validity because we're experiencing everything in real life. We're investigating real life situations. So there should be high levels of ecological validity. And if there is, then that should lead to us being able to generalize our results. Problems with natural experiments, and this is similar to field experiments, is that there's much less control, so there'll be a high level of extraneous and possibly confounding variables. And because of that, we can't be sure that it was the IV that caused the DV change. These experiments are difficult to replicate. If we think of people's stress levels before and after a volcano eruption, for example, we might have to wait quite a while before we can investigate the next volcano eruption. In order for us to do a proper experiment, we need to randomly allocate participants to both conditions, but because those conditions actually occur naturally, we're not doing any of that. And also we're faced with the fact that the participants have got a unique sort of character. Okay. So let's just check where we're up to on this. You should be able to say quite clearly what the difference between a field experiment and a natural experiment is. Can you? Give yourself 5 seconds. And in a field experiment, as we've seen, the psychologist can still manipulate the independent variable. So we might think of something like Pilyarvin, and we talked about the subway Samaritan experiments that we've looked at. But in a quasi experiment, the variables are manipulated by nature, and that's why it's called a natural experiment. Don't make a copy of the tables. We'll go straight on to look at some other activities. Apologies, I should have deleted this slide. So you need to think, and we're becoming we've covered quite a lot of research methods now. So you need to think, what would be the best way of finding out the answer to these questions? Do changes in lighting, heating, and breaks, is that going to affect the productivity of workers? How much do they, how much work do they get done? How many jobs do they get done at a certain time? Again, I'll flash through these, but you can pause through these and try these. Next one. We should study how parents in Essex bring up their children. What would you use? What kind of experiment would you use? And which design would you use? Again, aggressive behavior on television. How does that affect people's behavior? Again, choose what kind of thing you think would be most appropriate. Pause these as we go. Number 4. Study how girls in Essex behave towards someone when they have a romantic interest in them. Again, lab experiment, field experiment, natural experiment. What age babies can recognize a human face? What was used there? I'll study whether some teachers are better than others. Would you do that? What kind of research method would you use? And what type of experimental design would you use? You have to study whether people really get better as a result of psychotherapy sessions. What would you use then? We wish to study whether there are measurable differences in the personalities of men and women. What kind of study would that be? Okay, I'm going to let you have a think about those further activities, and I look forward to seeing you at the next lesson. This has been a Pat Haggerty broadcast for Psychology TV.